Welcome to Unwritten Asia. We bring you weekly Asian history that are not on the textbook, from an insider perspective. Today we're going to talk about a cup of coffee that was invented during a war, because a cafe founder in Hanoi ran out of milk. There's a war on, bombs are falling, supply chains are broken, and a coffee owner in Hanoi has run out of milk. What he made instead, out of desperation, with whatever was on the shelf, is now one of the most distinctive coffees on earth. But here is the thing nobody mentions when they tell this story. That cafe owner's problem didn't start with a shortage of milk. It started almost 100 years earlier, in Paris. What does a decision made in Paris in the 1850s have to do with a cup of coffee in wartime Hanoi? We'll get there. Here's where the chain starts. In 1858, the French Navy sailed into Vietnam. Within a few decades, they controlled the country's land, its economy, and, critically, what got planted in its soil. France had a coffee problem. Demand back home was rising. Their colonies in the Caribbean had been devastated, first by revolution, then by fierce competition, then by the slow collapse of the plantation system. Vietnam's central highlands, around the regions we now call Dak Lak and Lam Dong, turned out to be almost perfect for a specific species of coffee called Robusta. Higher altitude, reliable rainfall, cheap colonial labour. France began planting coffee in Vietnam at scale in the late 19th century. That's domino one falling. Now, most people, when they think of coffee, think of Arabica, the kind in your fancy single-origin bags, the kind that gets tasted like wine and described as having notes of dried apricot and light caramel. Robusta is different. It's stronger, more bitter, higher in caffeine, and for a long time, the coffee industry treated it like a second-class citizen. But Robusta is what France planted across Vietnam, and it grew extraordinarily well. Fast forward past the colonial period, past 2 wars, past reunification, and by the 1990s, Vietnam had become the second largest coffee producer in the world, second only to Brazil, ahead of Colombia, ahead of Ethiopia. Vietnam now supplies a large portion of the Robusta that goes into instant coffee and espresso blends globally, which means there's a reasonable chance your morning coffee, whatever the label says, has Vietnamese Robusta in it. But that is only half the story. Because all of this, the colonial planting, the Robusta crop, the second largest producer in the world, none of it explains the cup. For that, we need to talk about a shortage and a war. Now we get to the milk problem. Vietnam was producing enormous quantities of coffee, but drinking it the European way, with fresh milk, was genuinely difficult. The climate is tropical. Refrigeration, especially before the mid-20th century, was limited. Fresh dairy didn't keep. It wasn't widely available in most Vietnamese cities. So what people used instead was sweetened condensed milk, shelf-stable, imported, often in cans. You see this pattern across Southeast Asia. Condensed milk in Thai iced tea, in Malaysian kopi, in Vietnamese iced coffee. That cold coffee that's become famous internationally. But then the French left, the wars came, supply lines broke down. Vietnam went through the First Indochina War, then the Second. Decades of conflict, cities under pressure, ordinary commerce disrupted. The small imported comforts that colonial-era trade had brought, condensed milk, certain goods, certain ingredients, became scarce. In Hanoi, sometime in the 1940s, Mr. Giang, the founder of what would become Giang Cafe, was working at the Metropole Hotel, now known as the Sofitel legend Metropole Hanoi, one of the grand French colonial hotels in the heart of the city. Condensed milk had become scarce. Exactly why, whether cost, supply disruption, or wartime rationing, is not definitively settled across sources. We should name that honestly. What Mr. Giang reached for instead was egg yolk. Here's the part of this story that never makes it into the food travel version. What Mr. Giang made that day shouldn't have worked, and the reason it did work, the reason egg and coffee hold together at all, traces directly back to Domino 1. Mr. Giang whipped egg yolk with honey and folded the foam into strong, dark coffee. The result was rich, slightly sweet, with a thick custardy foam sitting on top of a deeply bitter espresso base. Now, here is what makes this more than a wartime improvisation. Arabica coffee, the delicate, bright, fruity kind, would have been overwhelmed by the egg foam. Too mild, the sweetness would have erased it. But Robusta is strong enough to push through. The bitterness holds the whole thing together. The egg foam works because of the Robusta, and the Robusta was there because of France. He called it café trứng, egg coffee. A colonial agricultural decision made in Paris about which bean grew cheapest in a distant territory is the reason this drink works at all. Here is the full chain, and I want you to sit with this for a moment. France needed labour and coffee in Southeast Asia. That decision planted coffee across Vietnamese highlands. Vietnam grew Robusta so effectively it became a global supplier. The coffee culture that colonial rule introduced was adopted and transformed by Vietnamese people into something entirely their own. And when wartime scarcity removed even the small European touch, the milk, what emerged was more Vietnamese than anything the French had intended. That cup, invented during wartime because a cafe founder had no milk, is now served in specialty cafes not only in Vietnam, but also in Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And the Robusta that makes it so distinctively strong and bitter, the very bean the French introduced because it was cheap and unproductive, is precisely what gives the egg coffee its character. Without Robusta, the egg foam would overwhelm it. The bitterness is what holds the whole thing together. A colonial decision about cheap labour, a wartime shortage of milk, a bartender who decided to improvise rather than apologise. That's the domino chain. And the cup at the end of it is extraordinary. If there's one thing this story keeps bringing me back to, it's this. Asians are remarkably good at adapting Western culture with local context. When you didn't have condensed milk during wartime, a Vietnamese cafe founder used egg as an alternative. And what came out the other side wasn't a compromise. It was something better. There are more examples of exactly this kind of adaptation across Asian cities, and that's what this channel is here to find. Subscribe if you want more Asian stories like this, not the food travel version, the one that traces it all the way back. And drop a comment. I want to know. Is there a food or drink in your culture that was born from scarcity, wartime, colonial, or otherwise, and became something people now love? I have a feeling egg coffee is not the only one. Next week we're going back to coffee, but this time we're going to Japan, where the government once ordered its citizens to drink it. Buddhist monks spent centuries fighting back, and the battle between those two cups is still being fought today. How coffee conquered Japan and why matcha fought back. That episode drops next week.